I never thought the hardest day of my life would get worse, but as I stood there beside Margaret's casket, tears streaming down my weathered face, I heard something that shattered what was left of my heart. Laughter. Not the gentle, fond remembrance kind that sometimes breaks through grief. No, this was cold, mocking laughter that cut through the hushed reverence of the funeral home like a blade. My son David stood just 10 feet away, surrounded by his friends, pointing at me as I clutched Margaret's favorite white roses. "Look at him," he whispered, loud enough for half the mourners to hear, crying like a baby. "She's gone, old man. Get over it." His voice carried that same cruel tone I'd heard too many times before, but never at his mother's funeral. The gasps from family friends were audible. Mrs. Henderson from next door covered her mouth in shock. Even the funeral director, a man who'd seen every kind of grief imaginable, shifted uncomfortably. But David just smirked, adjusting his expensive tie, the one Margaret had bought him for his last birthday, hoping it would help him land that job he'd been chasing. I felt my knees buckle as the weight of 37 years of marriage crashed down on me. Margaret had been my anchor, my voice of reason, my everything. And here was our son, the boy she'd loved more than her own life, treating her memory like it was some kind of joke. The roses trembled in my hands as I placed them gently on her casket, whispering words of love that David would never understand. It hadn't always been this way. I remember when David was 7, running to me after school with scraped knees and broken toys, trusting me to fix everything. Margaret would watch from the kitchen window, her face glowing with pride as she saw our little family working together in the garage. But somewhere along the way, success had poisoned him. The college degree I'd worked double shifts to pay for, the car I'd co-signed for when his credit wasn't good enough, the down payment I'd given him for his first apartment, none of it seemed to matter anymore. Each gift, each sacrifice, only seemed to feed his growing sense of entitlement. "He's just going through a phase," Margaret would say whenever I'd bring up David's increasingly cold behavior. She'd make his favorite dinner when he'd visit, hoping to recapture those warm family moments we'd once shared. But David would barely look up from his phone, treating our home like a free restaurant where the service was never quite good enough. That last Christmas we'd all spent together, David had rolled his eyes when I'd tried to share a story about my father. "Nobody cares about your ancient history, Dad," he'd said, while Margaret quietly cleared the table, her disappointment evident in the way her shoulders sagged. That night, I'd found her crying in our bedroom, clutching a photo of David from his high school graduation. "I don't know what happened to our sweet boy," she'd whispered. Neither did I, but I was about to find out that Margaret had been paying closer attention than any of us. Realized. The reception hall buzzed with uncomfortable whispers. I could feel eyes on me as I sat alone at a corner table, picking at the sandwich someone had placed in front of me. The food tasted like cardboard, but everything had lost its flavor since Margaret left. "I can't believe David acted that way," I heard Mrs. Patterson whisper to her husband. At his own mother's funeral, Margaret would be mortified. Other voices joined in, creating a symphony of disapproval that should have brought me comfort, but only deepened my shame. Across the room, David held court with his college buddies, their laughter echoing off the walls like a slap in the face. He'd loosened his tie and rolled up his sleeves, as if this were just another Friday night out instead of his mother's memorial service. When our eyes met briefly, he raised his beer bottle in a mock toast, that same cruel smirk playing on his lips. Margaret's sister Carol approached my table, her own eyes red from crying. "Robert," she said softly, sitting beside me, "I'm so sorry. Not just about Margaret, but about ... That she glanced toward David with a look of disgust. "She wouldn't have wanted this." I nodded, unable to trust my voice. Margaret had always been the peacekeeper, the one who smoothed over David's rough edges and made excuses for his behavior. Without her buffer, the true nature of what our relationship had become was laid bare for everyone to see. I was just a broken old man, grieving alone while my son celebrated his newfound freedom from family obligations. But Margaret had always been smarter than both of us, and tomorrow, at the reading of her will, I would discover just how smart she really was. That night, I sat in our empty house, surrounded by 40 years of memories. Every corner held traces of Margaret, her reading glasses on the end table, her coffee mug still in the sink from that last morning when she'd kissed my forehead and told me she loved me before the ambulance came. I thought about all the times I'd defended David to Margaret when her concerns about his behavior grew stronger. "He's just ambitious, honey," I'd said. "He'll come around." How wrong I'd been. How blind I'd chosen to be. The college tuition I'd paid by working weekends for 3 years straight. The car repairs when he'd wrecked his Honda because he was texting while driving. The credit card debt I'd quietly paid off when he'd overspent during his finding myself phase in Europe. Each memory felt like a stone in my chest, growing heavier with the realization that none of it had meant anything to him. Margaret had seen it all, felt every slight and dismissal that David had thrown our way. While I'd been hoping for change, she'd been documenting the reality. While I'd been making excuses, she'd been making plans. The phone rang twice that evening, friends calling to check on me. Their voices careful and concerned. Both mentioned David's behavior, tiptoeing around their shock with well-meaning phrases like grief affects everyone differently. But I heard the real question in their voices. How could a son treat his father that way on such a day? I didn't have an answer then, but I was about to get one. 3 days later, we gathered in Attorney Morrison's oak-paneled office. The same people who'd witnessed David's cruelty at the funeral now sat in leather chairs, their faces carefully neutral. David arrived 15 minutes late, breezing in without an apology, checking his phone as he took the seat directly across from Morrison's desk. "Sorry, I'm late," he said, not sounding sorry at all. Traffic was murder. He actually used the word murder at his mother's will reading, causing Carol to visibly wince. Morrison, a dignified man in his 70s, who'd handled our family's legal affairs for decades, pulled out a thick manila folder. His expression was unreadable, professional, but I caught something in his eyes when he looked at Davida, flicker of satisfaction that made my pulse quicken. "Before we begin," Morrison said, adjusting his glasses, "I want to note that Mrs. Margaret Phillips came to see me several times over the past 2 years. She was very specific about her wishes and insisted that everything be documented thoroughly." David leaned back in his chair, supremely confident. He'd already started mentally spending his inheritance, I could tell. Just that morning, I'd overheard him on the phone talking about a sports car he wanted to buy, telling someone that his old lady had finally done something useful by dying and leaving him money. "Margaret was always thorough," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. Morrison nodded, and something passed between us on understanding that made my heart race with anticipation. David drummed his fingers on the armrest, impatient to get this formality over with so he could claim his prize. Morrison cleared his throat and began reading. "I, Margaret Elizabeth Phillips, being of sound mind and body, do hereby distribute my earthly possessions as follows." His voice carried the weight of legal authority, each word precise and final. David straightened up, suddenly paying attention. The drumming stopped. "To my beloved husband, Robert, who has stood by me through 40 years of marriage with unwavering devotion, I leave our family home, all savings accounts, my retirement funds, and my jewelry collection, valued at approximately $450,000. The room was dead silent. David's face went pale, then red, then pale again. "What?" he whispered, leaning forward as if he'd misheard. Morrison continued without pause. "To my son David, I leave my collection of books, my gardening tools, and the sum of $5,000, enough to cover the cost of grief counseling, which I strongly recommend he pursue." The gasp that escaped David was audible. Carol covered her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. Other family members shifted uncomfortably, not sure where to look. "That's impossible," David sputtered, jumping to his feet. "She wouldn't time her son. I'm supposed to inherit everything." Morrison held up a hand, his expression stern. "Please sit down, Mr. Phillips. There's more." David remained standing, his hands clenched into fists, his face a mask of rage and disbelief. The entitled smirk was gone, replaced by something ugly and desperate. For the first time in years, he was hearing the word no, and he clearly didn't know how to process it. The power had shifted, and everyone in the room could feel it. Morrison pulled out a sealed letter, Margaret's handwriting visible through the thin paper. "Your mother also left a personal statement explaining her decisions. She insisted it be read aloud." My hands trembled as Morrison's voice became Margaret's words. "To my dear Robert, you have been the love of my life and my greatest blessing. Your kindness, patience, and unwavering support deserve to be rewarded, not taken for granted." I felt tears welling up, but this time they weren't tears of grief, they were tears of gratitude and vindication. "To David," Morrison continued, and I could hear Margaret's disappointment in every word. "I had hoped that maturity would teach you the value of family and respect. Instead, I watched you become cruel and entitled, treating your father's love as weakness and my devotion as obligation." David's face twisted with rage. "This is bullshit. She was losing her mind at the end. Everyone knows that. Mrs. Phillips underwent a psychological evaluation just 2 months ago," Morrison said calmly. "She was declared completely competent. In fact, she anticipated this reaction from you." "David," she wrote, "I expect David will contest this will and claim I was incompetent. The psychological evaluation in my files will prove otherwise." The room fell silent again. Margaret had thought of everything, planned for every contingency, even in death. She was protecting me from our son's greed and cruelty. Morrison looked directly at David. "Your mother also wrote, 'I pray that losing this inheritance will teach David what I couldn't, that love and respect cannot be bought, but their absence comes with a price.'" David exploded. "You manipulated her," he screamed, pointing at me with a shaking finger. "You poisoned her against me. You made her write this." I sat quietly, feeling a strange calm wash over me. For once, I didn't feel the need to defend myself or make excuses for his behavior. "Mr. Phillips," Morrison said sternly, "I need to inform you that your mother specifically addressed these accusations. She provided me with recordings of several conversations where you spoke disrespectfully about your parents, including one where you called your father a pathetic old fool and said you couldn't wait for them to die so you could finally live your own life." The color drained from David's face. He'd forgotten about Margaret's habit of recording family calls, a safety measure she'd started using after a phone scam attempt years earlier. She also documented the times you asked for money while simultaneously complaining about having to visit, the time you called her a nagging old woman when she asked about your job search, the Christmas when you told her that her cooking tasted like nursing home food. Each revelation hit David like a physical blow. The family members present, his aunts, uncles, and cousins, stared at him with disgust and disappointment. "You're all pathetic," David shouted, his composure completely shattered. Sitting here acting like she was some kind of saint, she was a controlling manipulator, just like him. He stormed toward the door, then spun around one last time. "This isn't over. I'll fight this will, and I'll win." The door slammed behind him, leaving us in stunned silence. But Morrison simply smiled and pulled out another document. "Your mother anticipated that threat as well," he said softly. After David left, Morrison showed me the additional documentation Margaret had prepared, character witness statements from neighbors, friends, and even David's former employers, a detailed account of every loan we'd given him, every insult he'd delivered, every holiday he'd ruined with his selfishness. "She spent 2 years building this case," Morrison explained. "She wanted to make sure that if David contested the will, he would lose decisively and publicly." I thought about Margaret during those final months, quietly gathering evidence while continuing to show David love and patience. She'd been protecting both of us, ensuring that his cruelty wouldn't be rewarded, and that I wouldn't spend my remaining years fighting a legal battle I couldn't afford. The other family members approached me one by one as we left Morrison's office. Carol hugged me tightly. "Margaret always said you were too good for this world, Robert. I'm glad she made sure David couldn't take advantage of that anymore." Uncle Frank, who'd stayed quiet during the reading, shook my hand firmly. "That boy needed to learn this lesson 30 years ago. Margaret was a smart woman to do this." As I drove home to the house that was now truly mine, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: peace. Not because I'd gained an inheritance, but because Margaret had given me something more valuable: vindication, and the knowledge that someone had truly seen and appreciated the man I'd tried to be. The neighborhood looked different somehow, brighter and more welcoming. Mrs. Henderson waved from her garden, and I realized that the shame I'd carried from David's behavior was beginning to lift. A week later, I found myself at Margaret's grave, holding a single white rose, her favorite. The headstone was simple but elegant, just like she'd been. I knelt down and placed the flower gently against the marble. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice catching in the morning breeze. "Not for the money or the house. Thank you for seeing me, for knowing who I really was when I'd almost forgotten myself." I told her about David's reaction, about Morrison's preparation, about the peace I'd found in her final act of love. "You always were the smartest person in the room," I said with a sad smile. Even when the room was empty, the sun broke through the clouds as I stood up, warming my face for the first time since she'd passed. I realized that Margaret hadn't just left me an inheritance, she'd left me my dignity, She'd ensured that the last chapter of our love story wouldn't be about loss and betrayal, but about recognition and justice. David never contacted me again. I heard through Carol that he'd tried to contest the will but gave up when Morrison showed him the mountain of evidence Margaret had compiled. He moved to another state shortly after, probably unable to face the community that had witnessed his true character. As I walked back to my car, I thought about the lesson Margaret had taught us both in the end. Love isn't just about giving, that's about recognizing what deserves to be given. Respect isn't automatically earned through blood. Relation it's built through consistent kindness and maintained through gratitude. Margaret's final gift to me wasn't money. It was the reminder that I was worthy of love, deserving of respect, and that sometimes the people who truly see us will fight for us even when we're too broken to fight for ourselves. In death, she'd given me back my life,